오야. 다 Cholam Shendu Zimba Seta Dela Kazangazo Dingela, that Dichimbarwa, Dala Chawa Junjunu Gomba, Dagiwa Dungi Tendo Gomba. Tene Dana Kumbugi Rashin Tadio Gomba. Tene Wanchugi Wangur Jinse, Dagana Shingi Tene Lesiji, Lena Lusiji Dunga Zamba. O da di chazan cholam du sheba di miteba da ririne pa ka che da dirin cholam shendu yoba ka kwa digi da tundu di sungu yore.
Up till now we've done the wrong ideas or refuting wrong ideas that there are other paths to liberation, and in those there was it is impossible to remove attachment to mind without abandoning self-grasping, the inaccuracy of considering a self faultless, then the inaccuracy of meditating on mind being the nature of suffering, then the inaccuracy of a person and nature being different as a path to suffering, and then the unsuitability of mortification as a means to exhaust the karma as a path to suffering. And after all of these, so all the various positions about what the nature of the path is and what a correct path is according to other views, and then refuting them. Today is right now there is the last section, which is the summary of refuting incorrect paths to liberation.
Chade minda seden da zomba gunla tenpa te nyamong le chuma yin tenda kowa pashi chas.
And so the verses are: not free of attachment, possessing craving, relying upon all manner of exertions, not free from afflictions and karma, such are known as samsaric beings.
Ta chade minda sedu dala chakwa da chawa minba che. Seden ta sedu dagi wala seba da tenpa che. Zomba gunla tenpa sedu ta dala chakwa da dala dagi wala chakwa da machewa dada dagrizimba yoba tishi shaje ti tingdu. Ani da dewi chirdu langdur kita ne zamba chiyorwa. O tende ne zamba, tende ne zamdi nge, tende kansa di ta nyamong da legi shenwan di chuli yoma res. Tende kansa di la ani kowa ba segi yores.
So not free of attachment refers to attachment to a self. So not free of attachment to a self. It's in the commentary if you read. Possessing craving means having craving to mind. And then based on this assumption that there is a self and there is mind, trying to do all sorts of things to satisfy its wants, which is the next line, which is relying upon all manner of exertions, such a person will not be free from afflictions and karma, and because of that, such people are known as samsaric beings.
Tena jigda pongo par tenpa nis, ta dende jigla leda nyamong bada lele tuwa mayin ba tenda watela kowa ba skeji shigi yoba indi ta dende jigda pongo par tenpa ta kowa le tuwa la kari pango go yores la na da dewe chido langdur ki zomba dezo meba cha kogorwa di meba cha bala da dagi wala seba chaya kogo yorwa di indi ta zawa jigda pongo go yoba indi tena jigda pongo par tenpa nis.
One second. Yeah. And now showing that one has to therefore to remove or uproot this attachment to self, which is then the cause for everything arising. The next verse is showing why one needs to remove the view of transitory collections, because as long as those are there, as long as there's a view of self and of mind, then one will not be able to be free from attachment, which will lead to craving and then all of those things. And so acting with this base or acting with the wish to satisfy such a being, such a self, is not going to lead to liberation, and therefore showing that one has to remove the view of transitory collections. Then there's the next verse.
Zawa tishi chudu 토메베 규진 리든 사변레 중외 지소 따와다 자원인이 용을 기스.
Therefore, those wishing for liberation uproot the view of transitory collection that has causes with no beginning and arises from seeds of similar type.
제바 직다 코르베 자와인바 대치르스 코왈레 저거 되바 남기 토마 메바니 중외스 직다 행게 자원인이 용을 기시스 직다 봉위 님보야 다음에 되베 셰럽 코나레 메베 람테 타르바주바 이노스.
The commentary says, because the view of transitory collection is the root of samsara, those who wish to attain liberation from samsara uproot this innate view of transitory collections that has been continuing from beginningless time.
So the tak zawanga chini budigi tenda ningbodi da disombare kandar dala seba the matena dagi wala seba the temituya dagi wala dada dagi wala seba the matena da devi chedu langdur zamba da kamiteya da devi chedu langdur zamba la jusona and dinde kansa dile de nyemu be shawanji yimba sonzan korwa ba dinde yindu da kowale targu yuna dada dagi wala seba pongo ya. So the dada dagi wala seba pongo ba yindu da seba gi zawa di jigda yimba sonzan ani jigda pong wala zyengu res da kandar dangzi jigso la tabe zawa di ani pongye la da byochen che go res da te pong nyembo di khari res la na te pong nyembo di dame to be shera nya ji res da dom di di kyung yor da khaji gi tholam shenpa pura ka che tama dom de ti res ung yor da.
So what it's saying is, as long as there's craving for the self, there will be craving for happiness. If there's craving for happiness, then that will lead to craving for mind. All actions that are performed through this attachment to the self that then sets off this attachment craving to happiness, to mind, and then to things. As long as that keeps happening, there will always be samsara, and there will be no liberation from it. And to remove all of this, one has to address the view of the self, which is why, to be able to be freed from this cycle or uproot this main cause that leads to this causal chain kind of being set off, the innate view of transitory collections has to be removed. And since the only thing that can remove the view of transitory collections, so then it says, since there is no other antidote other than the wisdom that realizes selflessness that can remove the view of transitory collections, such a path can lead to liberation. So after having refuted all other views as possible alternatives to attain liberation, here the final summary is only the view of transitory collections. There is no antidote other than the wisdom that realizes selflessness that can lead to such liberation. Therefore, such a path can lead to liberation. Others will not be able to.
Di yingi dribe namba la lokbar shukba dame tobe sherab yugi nilu chinchi ma loba tokba mimba tang dungin gomba so samdengi kebar gashi tuyalamdo zimba gaane dame ngusumdu tobe sherab tekwana yi tobe driba yimbar tenba yinus.
Till here, by refuting the mistaken views that must misperceive the aspect of actualization, that is one of the four aspects of the path, that mistakenly apprehend the wisdom of selflessness as not unmistaken with respect to the nature of its object, along with the mistaken view of certain concentrations, meditating on suffering are paths to liberation, the wisdom that directly realizes selflessness is shown to be the means for actualizing reality.
So that lamdingi namba lo lokor shuba lam rikba druba sejida drube namba lo lokor shuba di karir islam na dame tobe sherab di yugi nilu chinchi ma loba tokba di lam di mares se geje shigi yoba yendu dipa kaache reso dipa kaache ani dame tobe sherab di ani yugi nilu chinchi ma loba toba ani yimba tang dende di ta thalam yimba geje shigi yendu drube namba la lokwa shubha di pa kaache ani lam rikba druba yima di sherta.
So after having shown, if you remember, apprehending the view of selflessness to not be unmistaken. So apprehending the wisdom of selflessness to not be the path was the wrong view. And then now on top of that, over here, we have also refuted certain concentrations that meditate on suffering being the paths to liberation. So after having refuted that the wisdom of selflessness is not a path to liberation, and that which was done in the second aspect, now with the third one, which is actualization, showing that certain concentrations that meditate on suffering are not paths for liberation, refuting this is now explaining the aspect of actualization, which is the third one.
Thalam teni me nyambatang, dame tobe shera thalam mai nyambatang, kadup so lam cho yin nyambatang, lam kange yang dunge ten se chabar minu nyamna, lam gombala jubur miguwe, lam gi namba shi temba yinos.
And then, because having any notions of any of the notions, such as the idea that there is no path to liberation, the notion that the wisdom realizing selflessness is not a path to liberation, that ideas, that things such as ascetic practices are superior paths, or the notion that there is no path that can definitively exhaust suffering, these four, as long as one has notions such as these, it will prevent one from engaging in the path, and therefore the four aspects of the path are taught.
Gobongundu cha lam gombar cha la yindu ta lam gombal jugorwa ta lam gombal jugoba yindu ani lam gombal jugola gegin ta chinjulo shi dire da.
So when the Buddha in the sutra where he teaches the four truths, when he teaches the truth of the path, he says meditate on the truth of the path. And so because the Buddha is telling us to meditate on the path, the things that prevent one from engaging in the path or meditating and cultivating the path are these wrong ideas or these notions that might act as obstacles that prevent one from entering or engaging, cultivating the path. And to do away with such obstacles, the four aspects of the truth of the path are taught.
Oh yeah. So that di inchi digi kari trubare islam na dine lugdogi shebashi nane thangbo kyoba sedi ta trubare.
So if you remember right in the beginning, there was this entire section is coming out from speaking of the reverse process. And in the reverse process, this was all a discussion that stemmed from explaining what the protector is. So right now what we have finished is, in the reverse process, this is an explanation of what the protector is, that has now concluded.
Ta di indu ta kyobe ngar ngazu do chagyogi songsimbe kyobe ta de da.
Do you remember the reason that was given for establishing the Buddha being the protector? Can you just give that reason again?
Oh yeah. That did you do chujin kare?
What was the subject?
Don't share you to chujin and share. What? Don't balkale inji.
Teacher?
Teacher, Otilamaya.
Teacher.
Don't share you to chujins. Sangi share you to chujins, my love.
So don't say, okay, when in Tibetan we say Tumpa Shakyatuba, which is more like the teacher Shakyamuni. So instead of Buddha, let's just put teacher Shakyamuni.
Right? So that Sangi Shakyatuba said, Digi Sabla, Tumpa Shakyatuba, Lava in a Chujindi, Tata Che. Right? Ta Kyoba in the Slabdugala, Dujisho Karere.
What's the predicate?
Oh. Ta Kyoba in this Kadu Lava Inaya, Mandiwa Kayomare, Inaya, Paseu Lola Sharesho to Karilagore, to what Tunyanam Kyoba in this.
So if you just say he is the protector, that's also okay. But to make it clearer, if you say he's a protector for those wishing to attain liberation, it's more effective.
To what Tunyanam Kyoba in this. Tanda Pande and Dawatrabegi, Tanda Sungji Yore. Sung Paje Sungji Nalola, Sangi Shodo Gendun, the Tarba Devanam Jobs. 상계 쳐다 겐드인데 타르바 되바 남기 겹스
There's this
바지반에 나와라 소인 삼스
there's this verse by Acharya Chandrakirti where he says the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha are protectors for those who wish to attain liberation.
그래서 디인들다 단단 간조 교바세디 지당 교바세디 가와 가살 고초구로 봐 가와 가살라 그래서 암질라인 교바 고초구로 봐 단단 간조 교발라이디 띵이 동행을 조회게제디 시기 요바인데 타르바 되반는디 그래서 와 동행 띵도 시버 되반는디 아니 교바디 수레스 단다 지주시기 요바인데 루지체텔라 아니 타르바 되반는디 교바인데스 와 좋아 동행는디 교바인데스 와다 띵지 가르래.
So here, when you say, if you just use the word protector, it could be kind of extended to even like a doctor or someone who protects you from something that you're suffering or you're facing some problem. That's why over here, when we say protector, it's helpful to clarify what exactly this protection, one is seeking protection from, or what this person is protecting from. And therefore it makes more sense, or it's more reasonable over here to say for those who wish to attain liberation. So that was that. What was the predicate? The reason. What's the reason?
소자다 저와 등에 남기 교바인데 저와 등에라 딘시닐루기 랑돌 친지말로바 라왕고니 돈버제비 예셔스 딘시티 샤송아 다 디인도다 딘시디기 초조쪽으로 와 돈버셔저 두바기 아니 저와 등에 남라 지 코발레 저와 등에 딘도 등에 시바 등에 강살라 아니 코와 코르단 간디 예메 코르만 주비림바 덴바 당부니 아니 코르발레 트웨림바 덴바 치마니 dombe demba shi sozo korban jugdo ge rimba denshi nilu ani chinji maloba rawanji gone ta tyendu temindus seyundu ta thandanga ju denshi du stena phapsha ba digi denshi namsha de shen sona an dendi denshi di zambuling di nalola thoma songen di demba shaja tu ba yimba di ngazu zmeerwa ta denshi di tuba yindu ani denshi di shinni ngazu tubarta.
So to get for this to be a correct sign or a correct reason, it has to be first at least the property of the subject, and in the property of the subject, he shows the unmistaken nature of the four truths to those who wish for liberation. The unmistaken nature of the four truths here is the two truths that lead to samsara or taking birth in samsara. And then the two truths that are to be abandoned, and then the two truths that are to be cultivated, which is the third and the fourth. And when we know that these are the four truths that are indispensable for one who wishes to attain liberation, that need to be known, cultivated, and can lead to liberation, then for the first time we have the property of the subject. Like for us, it will become the property of the subject. Once we know that the property of the subject is there, then the fact that in our world, the first person to teach the four truths was Shakyamuni Buddha, that is something that we don't need further to prove, or we know that, and therefore through his own power, that part of the reason also comes together. And so then finally we have a complete understanding of the reason, which is he shows the unmistaken nature of the four truths to those who wish for liberation through his own power or through his own means.
So that de denshi langdor nilu chinji maloba skeje shedeba di ani keranzo lola tadong dosije sebu shama ina yabu yorta kanda kariyor slava ina ta keranzo 인지 민지 좀 샤저 두바 랑라랑 아니 교바 임바 이제 최고예요 말에 개대 소주 삼류 나로라 셴바지 좀 셴바지 다 간다 디 교바인 조바 되는 게 교바인세 이 삼루지 코고 요바이나 간다 딘시디 창고래 딘시 가래 창고래라나 딘시 랍데 디기 차바 딘시기 타니 세우 송야로 마송야로 간다 denshi se di thonda nyumbu de khare la gore demba thangbu ni di kowan jugu rimba se gorwa di indu kowa kordan di kowa kore di gyu zawa khari gi kowa kurgi yume jigche reswa teni kowan dobu rimba she yundu kowa kuji gi gyu zawa di indu zawa di nyuje gi nyumbu dir sechi di indu kowan jugdo gi rimba tensha ba temba tela ya rigbi neba me deba chinji malo dengenji susu gi yichi lepsona dende kansa di susu gi gyoba zi chorda 다 dende kansa di suyine suro kyorangi gyoba zi chorda
Zawe ta nala langdo rinne chinji malo go tinudu. Te chuksha.
yagi chugo mara yagi rangja sha tandangi deshi ga ro
So when you are thinking about it, whether you consider the Buddha to be a protector or you consider someone else to be a protector doesn't really matter, because whatever one feels is a source of refuge or is a protector, irrespective of who they might be or what tradition they might belong to, the important thing to be sure of is that what they teach is able to clarify what we need to abandon and what we need to cultivate if we wish to attain liberation. So whatever we might believe is a source of refuge for us or is a protector for us, when that is the subject, if the reason can be verified on that subject, which is they teach the unmistaken nature of the Four Truths in terms of what to abandon and what to cultivate for those who wish to attain for liberation through their own power, if the reason is established on whatever one might believe is a protector, then it's enough. Then trusting them and following them will lead to the result, because what they're showing or what they have illustrated is the path to attain liberation entirely by explaining what it is that prevents one from attaining liberation, so what needs to be abandoned and what one needs to cultivate. Once this reason is there, then it doesn't really matter who the person is, because one has got what one wants. So the most important thing is trying to prove the reason on whatever one believes or whoever one has faith in as a protector.
다 단대샬라 nganzu chazang kowa le chöme ba koroba yimba di tangi koroba yimbe ta chikyo so di chazang nganzu chang dik dwa.
So right now, as it stands currently, when we like being able to identify ourselves or see that we are samsaric beings, the reason for why or for what makes a samsaric being or what are kind of the characteristics of a samsaric being is the one that we just saw. And we know that we have all of those qualities that qualify one to be a samsaric being.
So that di indi nganzo la ta su gugu yoresla na kyoba nganzo le kyoba khandish gugu yorela na thangbo de la dungel senge di khari yime dungel gi ngo pa chasang ba ngo twenge ji gugu yor thangbo de la.
So what we need, like, if you kind of start to list out the qualities that someone like us needs to ensure that they can protect us, then the first quality that is needed is that it has to be someone who can clearly explain and help us understand what suffering is.
So the di indi dende sunghengi kansari digi 동해 덴바스네 단다 타니디 표시 체자로 미세자로 타니 표시 체메지 가리 있는 만나 딱한도 동일 세드 가리레 세기 동일 뭐 차상어지 모종의 당부치체 모종을 디 모종 사회 제라 틴디기 규디 디레 디기 짜와 디레 세지 딱 모종의 구구요래 디인디 군중된 바세디 타니 군중된 바 표시 체자로 마세자로 간도 동해 용의 규 쪼디 디레 디기 짜와 디레 생기지 딱한다 대시 잡동이지 디땡이지 고구요리.
So whether they say they use terms like the truth of suffering or dukkha or whatever you might feel is necessary doesn't matter, as long as they can accurately and correctly identify and explain what suffering is, irrespective of the terms they use. This is like the main requirement for such a person if they are to be considered like someone who can offer protection. And then above and up on top of that, they also have to be able to identify and explain and make us understand what the cause of that is and what the root of that is. So what the cause and the root of this suffering is. Again, whether they choose to use terms such as the truth of causes is totally insignificant, as long as they can clearly explain what those causes are.
디스와 다 디니 대시 잡투나 덴바 당군이 대시 잡투고 요르다. 덴바 시기나니 덴바 당군이 코로와 죽을 림바데 대시 차상와 잡았다.
So if that person can explain these two things, then they have been able to clearly make one understand what the causes for being in samsara are. So whether they've used the words or not, they have explained what the first two truths are that lead to samsara.
디딕스와 다 디인데 다 디젤라 아니 코로와 코르지기 코로와 딱한다 둥이 차상와지 디시께 요바 인도 둥이 디기 규딘디지레 규디기 자와 디레스 라바 인도 아니 자와 텔라 뉴지기 님부 디레 세게더니 님부 람디 셰 통해지 총바이나 람딘 셰 두고요.
So after being able to explain what suffering is, where it stems from, what its causes and what its root is, if they can also on top of that clearly help one understand what the antidote to this entire process is, or how to overcome this, then whether they again have used the words or not, they have been able to clearly make us understand that there is a path to overcome these causes.
디인도다 딘디기 람디 곰발라 땡체 아니 둥예기 규든 디 자와 용수조가 세용도 아니 고바 스케란 땡도 대와세야디 다 용도 그레스 계제시기 요바인도 아니 덴바치만이디다 셰투고 요르다.
And by being able to explain that there is an antidote, they are effectively also making you understand, or making us understand, that when this antidote is applied, it is going to be able to entirely uproot the source of all of these problems, and that therefore there is a state where one can entirely uproot the causes for suffering. And so by being able to do this, they are able to explain the third and the fourth truth, which is how to overcome cyclic existence or the continuing of suffering.
디레 소자다 디인도 땅안졸라 안졸라 껴미기 껴바디 칸디시 구구둘람나 다 디시 땡케 코르와 주베림바 왕도시비 니 코르와 도베림바 왕도시비 니 칸데 디시 친지 말로바다 디시 땡겐데랑 아주 껴바세 거다 다 디시 땡샤바디 딱딱 야부지 땡투메나 껴바 친지 상을 차기 메워 손자 안 덴디디 나저기 깜넬 집에 이나야 다 친주로 차시 버다 나저로 껴 미통에 들라다 껴바 지로로 와다 디시 친지 말로바 땡통해지 여바이나 안디 껴바 친지 상을 차버 다 껴바 운에 차버다.
So if one is able to find someone who has or can teach these four, so what we need for someone to be a protector is that they have to have at least this four, which is they have to have been able to explain or make us understand and realize the nature of suffering and what it comes from. Therefore, the two causes that lead, or the two aspects that lead to being stuck in samsara or being stuck in suffering, and the antidote to this and the result from this antidote, which is how one gets out of suffering. So the bare minimum requirement for someone being a protector is someone who can explain these four aspects. If someone can explain these four aspects, then we consider them someone who is a protector and someone who you can take refuge in. If we take refuge, or we consider someone to be a protector who does not know these four, or does not explain these four, or does not make us understand these four aspects, then we may consider them protectors, but because what we want will not be attained from them, that idea of conceiving of them as a protector will be inaccurate. So it will become an inaccurate perception or a misperception of someone as a protector when actually they are not, because they do not have these four qualities.
So the tang ngar chuen sim bitumba shagyo to bare da na shi mudi bitumba ngar chuen sim ba yore. Koran zogi da dindegi namsha shi tuen sim bar da. Tuen sim ba ji tanda nga zo lobzun chi yoder da. Yode ba yindu diniga da sujogi dunge den ba kharis te shi yagido. Tomba digi dunge den ba temba digi ani temba shi de shi khande yagido. Tomba shamba digi nenga shi di khande shi yagido. Di tuen sim ba di yindu dit sosoge ta an di kawala di karil ribyo neba do me do seja ani gang ribyo neba meba di thonsona digi jeso da digi jeso soso jukshi ba yindu ta ribyo neba meba thon yindu tinde de la sosoge gyoba ziru kurwa di gyoba ziru nimo tele ta nga dungeli kyongi de ta temba dirisha sege semnang la la samlo khorbi nimo semde la semnang lo ta yishillebi nima thangbo tela ta nga ju gyulo karikere 상계를 겹수 세 덤벌을 겹수 세게다 잠도 탕부 티키르다.
So what we do have currently is that we have at our, like, it's available to us. We have teachings by the Buddha and we have teachings by other masters of other traditions, all of whom have taught these four aspects. So we have complete teachings of these four aspects according to different masters and different teachers of different traditions. Our job is to see what they say. So what does the Buddha have to say about what suffering is, where does it come from, how to overcome it, and the state that is freed of suffering. How do other traditions or how do other masters, how do other teachers speak of what suffering is, the causes, the antidotes, and the state resulting from these antidotes. And so our job is to see which one makes most sense to us or which one seems most accurate to us. And then when, through our own reasoning and reflection and our own investigation, if we come to find that the teachings of the Buddha are unmistaken with respect to liberation that I want to attain or freedom from suffering that I want to attain, then that wish that one generates in that moment through this process will become the first time one takes refuge in the Buddha. So when we take refuge and we say, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and the Sangha, that taking refuge in the Buddha, that day when we actually go through this process and we see the Buddha as a protector, that day or that moment, that first thought will be the first time we actually take refuge in the Buddha. Or we have this mind of refuge towards the Buddha.
다 디나시 지부지사 상계기 송샤바 덤바 샤게 도베기 송샤바 남샤 딘졸라 직비도 샤바 챤인데 겐다지 통안 텔레 셴바 추르비 덤바지기 송샤베 남샤 딜라 수수기 김제 야가지 통체 이 김제 야가지 통체 오땅 코발을 저고도나 문에고는 경력이 람등이 덤바 디리샤 세제 추르비 덤바텔라 이실레소나 디님은 추르비 덤바텔라 점수주베 겸도 개버시.
If instead, when one looks at the teachings of the Buddha, one finds an inconsistency or sees that something is not right, and we find some fault in the teaching of the Buddha, and we find that there is another presentation that seems more accurate or more complete or less contradictory, then that day when we find that the presentation for how to remove suffering is not in the teachings of the Buddha but somewhere else, that day when we will realize that if we want to attain liberation, this is the path that one has to follow because this is not contradictory, it doesn't have any error, then that's the day when we will have generated a mind of refuge towards whatever teacher the teacher of that tradition.
So the induta tumba sangel capsu tuginanda, shurubi tumba capsu tugin, capsu rodan dirita. Capsu rodan nigal look tagaranje.
So whether one takes refuge in the Buddha or one takes refuge in another teacher or in another tradition or in another master, doesn't really matter which tradition you take refuge in. The way to take refuge or what refuge is this. This is the way that refuge happens. This is what refuge is. What it's directed to is another issue. But what refuge is and how one goes for refuge is this. This is the way to do it.
이네다 디 딘디기 capsu rodan di 친왕니가 로당 찍버리대 다 치료 레디 대상이 주소로 셔바 이나다 간다 치료 덤발 잡수 중에 로당디 할람 냠상에 도지였다 딘디시 잡수 중 공부 쉬우다 냠상에 도지요 로당디.
So even though this is the way to take refuge in the Buddha or any other tradition, in our present day, this way of going for refuge or this way of seeking refuge, in other traditions, this manner of going about doing it, it seems to have declined, or it seems almost like it's not really present in other traditions. In the past, they would exactly follow the same exact process that we're discussing here, that is applicable to the Buddhist tradition or a non-Buddhist tradition. So other traditions in India as well, they would take refuge in this way, after having gone through this self-reflection and analysis. And if we now say, well, we have it in the Buddhist tradition, if you look a little bit closer, this way of going for refuge, even with the Buddhist tradition, really is kind of at the last drops, and it's just about to exhaust itself. If you kind of do like a poll and see how many people consider themselves Buddhist and what percentage of those take refuge like this, it's not going to be much higher than 10, if at all.
So that the 가르치는 가서 딘디 도단신 두고 요말은 대다 슝딘조 가서 떼기 요말 다 디르던다도.
And the reason why we don't go for refuge like this, if you ask or one wonders, is because we don't really care about texts like this. We don't read them, we don't study them, we don't reflect on them.
땅 가서 디 룽바 셔마나 디 슝고나 다리 요규 말해 봐지 슝고나 규르고로 요규 말해 다 슝규에 대버디 가서 피주낭데나 슝디 요버래 이네 벼바다 히말라야다 디도 사마다 도단 슝디간에 두고 요래 슝디도 규르샤바디 요로다 이네 디 슝디 디 슝디 롭전 제자 아니 캡스 중에 가져 있으라다 공부 쉬우르다.
So firstly, in most of the other countries that Buddhism spread to, a text like this one is not even, it doesn't exist in any language outside of Sanskrit and Tibetan. And in India we know what the state is, and in Tibetan, even though this text does exist and it has been translated in Tibetan, if we consider how many people in Tibet or in the Himalayan regions of India that follow and can follow Tibetan as a language, how many of them actually read, reflect on, understand the meaning of this text, and then take refuge in this way, it's quite clear that it's not really happening.
Even
it's the same with me. When I first became Buddhist, I did not take refuge in this way that's being described here. So I had a dual transformation into Buddhism. The first one was before studying, and then another one was after studying this text.
What a dirisha. Tai Kederita, Tensan Tuzela, modern Jela, and Tembasawa Tunsigri, Yoreta, Tembasawa and Yoro, the Tesa, Naranzu Mito di Mito Chicks Josaya de Nalola, Chik Guru Sawa de Tensona, Chik Chu Sungu Lam Sunguduna, Tiangi, you see, Sangi Sungshawa Teta, Nargi Churumudiba Sungshawa Tela Tesam, Chikimiduna, Tesam modern Guru Sodo, Shengen Sodo, or Denzoka Denzolani, Chebache. In a Chebache, Tishi Tarare, Koi Lamshi di Karisungudu.
So if we are not satisfied with what the teachings of the Buddhists are, or what the teachings of the non-Buddhists are from the past, and we feel drawn to wanting some kind of contemporary guru who's more up to date with our times, and there are many such gurus, that's totally fine. There's nothing that prevents that from happening, or even wanting to pursue this wish. But if that is a wish that we have, whoever we identify as someone who we want to follow, to test whether they are valid in their ability to lead us to where we want to get to, the analysis of whether they are valid or unmistaken is still the same. It's still going to be seeing whether these four things are present in the teachings that they're giving. It's the same. So it doesn't matter who it is, the way to test and see whether they are even reliable sources or who can offer protection is the same. That's not going to change.
그봐. 소소 다 둥이 시에요인데 둥이 nga르마 시에바 사와 가리 시에도 식시에도나 아야 녀마든 저기 둥이 딱다 시에 두면도 다둥 둥이 친지 몰라고 제송 라이지 라기로 봐. 녀마 시에샤바 디 그런 게 디시게샤바 디 상기비 슝니 튕거도나 아디도 상기 녀만 시에사샤. 디 디시 갑데디 아 치루비 슝니 튕데지나 아디도 치루비 덤바 녀만 디시게 그런 사와 개미레면도. 다나신기 그런 게 탑람직 시에샤바 탑람디 상기비 쳔나 얘기도나 디 ngani 시에사리 디 그런 사와스게 말해. 디니양 고랑이 슝니 세셰베 탑론디 치료비 슝니 녀만 셰샤지 텐손 치료비 슝나 텐손나 디 녀만 뜸비 숭샤저레 고랑게 싸와케 말해 디인디 크기 탄다 지금 모디파이션 셰베 이네야 셰디 고랑이 닝지 모드 셰가 제르 마도 탑론 미세 셰르 마도 싸와케 셰요 말해 디인디 고랑이 라왕군 뜸바디 마차기 말해.
So if there is someone who we feel very drawn to or very inspired by, who's kind of more contemporary. But then when you look at what they're saying, if the content of what they're saying, how they identify suffering, or what they explain suffering to be, is something that we understand, but then we see that it is essentially the same thing that is either being spoken of was spoken of by the Buddha, or was spoken of by some non-Buddhist teacher, then what they're saying is not you, it's not unique to them. Similarly, if the solutions that they provide are solutions that sound very interesting or they're very appealing, but then when you go and look at exactly what they're speaking of, if that is also something that has already been spoken of in some non-Buddhist tradition or in a Buddhist tradition, then what they're saying is not new. So their contribution at that point doesn't become new. What they're doing is they're just kind of remodifying or re-elaborating ideas in ways that sound a little more appealing to us. But the content that they've got is coming from somewhere else. That's why what they're saying is not through their own power.
딜랑한 주기다 남규이나 똠바스는 시라 밍따기 요만텔라 똠바스에 밍따기 요만 가죠. so 기겐도 차기로 와 있는 똠바스에 밍도 토고 요말해.
So again so the Tibetan word tumba, which literally translates into teacher, we don't use that word for such a person. We might call them our own kind of guide or something like that, but we don't call them teacher.
So 당한지 남규 탄이 표시 제연데 똠바세 탄이디 당부딩어서 상기 샤주투발 표시시기를 가진라나 디 코랑기 라왕토 랑도 비셀 톤 숭버서로 저와 다 디니마 셴바사마 콩기 숭샤바 다가나 마 데시 탑란 키우톤 데시 야샤베디 가리모 가리디시 야바는 텔로 똠바스 밍따기 요 말해 예인디 똠바샤주투바 라오마도 디니마 진주기 로마 솔라 베는 예대주부 요송이나다 공가우이나 샤리부 수이나 콘솔라 똠바스 밍따기 요 말해.
That's why in the way that we refer to the Buddha as the teacher Shakyamuni, because the teaching that he gave was something that he realized and he did through his own ability. All the followers of the Buddha, whether it's Mahakashyapa or Ananda, even though they may have given the same teaching and they may have given it in a way that sounds more like it works better for us, we don't call them teacher because they were not the one that started this tradition or the one who brought this out.
The teacher lago marsidi gegen lago marsigo marta tumbaseedi.
So we're not saying that they're not a teacher in the literal sense of the word teacher that we use in English. It's the kind of title that you give to Shakyamuni, which is the teacher Shakyamuni. That title is not given to others.
Lam tumbalana kadlaga. Inchitola.
Lam tumba. Someone who shows the path.
Oh, the dita oda.
So kind of teacher over here is more like
Teacher ki sabla tal.
I don't know. We'll have to find a different word because it's both in English both tumba and gegen are the same. I'll just see. Tumba.
Huh? That is just
Los.
That you need tumba say tiny niba dingazo nam you yongda page shede but kawai penguin pagolulu chigo.
Another person who we use this title for is Arya Nagarjuna. We use the same title also for Arya Nagarjuna.
소자 템바딜 톰바 니버 차스 가서 랍규여다 상기기 템바딜 톰바 니버 나신데 임바 인디 땡은 파볼루루 시지 톰바 파볼루루 톰바기 당해 부지시고
So the way that Arya Nagarjuna is referred to, it is said he is like the second teacher of the teachings. He is known as the second teacher of the teachings.
소자 디 가르친rellam나 파볼루루 고블루루 쳔베 카도 텔라 치징기 도레 따 가서 잠블링 도제 따 야가나로라 할람 따 지기 시징기 도기 템바데 할람 따마 냠드 소로 수지기 지시 야마토 수지기 공발 레마토 시마토가 딘디 투지지글 샤디디 아니 신이 곰볼루르게데 곰볼루르게드네 코라미시 기긴 디자니 장 기긴 디 ngal di tesung이 시행세 매바신 코랑기 랑도게드니 곰볼루르게드니 상기 시징기 도이 공바마 제바디 총바로와 디인디 상기 샤조도바나 신지 중송세기다 디디 용다기지 게라디 차바인디 콩라 덤바니바세 당기 표지나
The reason why we use this title of teacher for Arya Nagarjuna is because when Arya Nagarjuna came, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Pragyaparamita Sutras, they were inexistent. It's like they were not there anymore. And so Arya Nagarjuna, what he did, his contribution was to take these Pragyaparamita Sutras and without hearing them from somewhere else, or without having learnt them from somewhere else, through his own power, through like his own abilities, he, by himself, not reliant on the teachings of someone else, he clarified or explained the meaning of the Pragyaparamita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And that's why Arya Nagarjuna is called the second teacher. No, it's kind of weird.
디 렉자를 칼레
Lekjalang, Sikoran, Lagi Yosamartagi. Tiresha.
Sanskrit 칭에 유나 셴바
Does anyone know what it is in Sanskrit? The Pevajogi Sugirish.
말마 디슝 리얼
The Yosamaragi.
리얼
Tago. Yeah. Oh no, yeah. Shasta.
어디
Yeah.
다 디페지시샤나 템발라이들라 티처 렉 삽
So instead of saying teacher, let's just say Shasta. Go back to Sanskrit.
와
Shasta.
뭐야
No,
다
no, those are
케스키면도
different words. Those are the different words.
아 케바키면도 다 들러도도 레스와
Did you get the meaning? Okay.
다 들러도도 다 간다 껴바 세당데 레스와다 껴바 간디 지금 가서 구구 유미디 하고서와
So have you understood what, now we're going to call it Shasta. Do you all know how to search for a Shasta, what the criteria are?
와 소서 다 디인디 껴바 세당데 가라래 딘시랑도기 네 친지말로 봐 라왕군이 덤바스 레스와 다 딘시랑도기 네 세디 다동 캐란줄로 세부수구도나 아니 코와 주도기 네 친지말로 코와 주기림바도 도기림바 칸도 주도기림바 친지말로 봐 라왕군이 땡게 딘디디 다 딘디 캐란라 녀소나 캐란라 껴바 녀르다 딘디 강사지 녀소나 껴바 녀르 디인디 다 딘디기 강사디 간디 세고르라나 nga르 직된데로 주연심 바지 쉔바 마세 딘디 슝 딘디기 니 남샤 된 상해식 다 딘디지 구구였다 잠릉 디나라 알리 당부 쳔여다 매다 통여여다 매다 아니 딘디기 숭 쳔여매 제 하마 홍아세 딘디 강사식 당부 치주매 딘디 세가로 깔레 카로다 그쪽바 두보로 신이 두보로 간데스 두보래
So if you have to look for someone who is a protector, here you're looking for someone who's the teacher, but Shasta, the way to do it is like this, to see if they have taught something where you will find this entire causes of suffering and how to overcome it. What suffering is, its causes, the path and the result. When you find someone who has done this, and you see whether it is accurate, what they're saying is accurate or not, then that's the correct way that one is looking for this person, because there has to be someone who has taught these four truths. Again, they don't have to be like the four truths in that sense, but these four aspects have to be taught, and they should have done it through their own power. That's when you can consider them with the title teacher. If in your search for such a person, you start off not by looking for someone who has come on this planet, has said something, and that thing that they have said, that teaching that they have given is something that we have access to and we can reflect on, and we speak of some sort of metaphysical character or some sort of saintly being who has never come on earth, then the abstraction that we are trying to analyze becomes even harder, because what we're trying to find is an actual source that we're trying to prove is an infallible being or is reliable as refuge for us. If the subject itself is some vague, distant idea that we have no clarity on, and is not something who was alive on our planet, who gave certain teachings, that we have those teachings to date that we can see and analyze, then this entire process gets unnecessarily confusing. So when you choose who to analyze, it's helpful to start off with someone real who came and has said something, and we have access to their teachings and we can check.
So the 태고 준비 쉬고나 진 제베이나 상계 망고 쉬고 열어봐. 배나 상계 여밤에 열어봐. 상계 여밤에 열대. 되니 상계 여밤이 껴봐 두고 주나 가르쳐 두고.
For instance, if you talk about Mahayana texts, there's many Buddhas, and amongst them, let's say there's Amitabha Buddha. How are you going to prove Amitabha is a teacher?
right? So that 당고 뒤두고 여밤에 당고 껴봐 두기 되나 깔래 가로다. 여밤에 대화적인 시간을 송열에 잠불링을 페이지에 가지고 셰드요 말에 송춘요 말에 대디 마디 취든데 나셔 송샤바 JSK 요 말에 매번 인데 아니 여밤에 껴봐 두고라 오늘 상기 두고라 오늘 상기 두고라 상기 남셔 신고 상기 남셔 신고 오늘 상기 된 사주 흉지 고르마도 디니자네 매요고 간데 상기 두고 루토야 메도와.
For instance, when we start describing who Amitabha is, he's in the pure realm of Sukhavati. And when you start saying all of these things, there's nothing for us to go on. There's nothing that he said, there's nothing that he's done. We don't have access to any of his teachings. We have no idea what he's saying. We have no idea what he's trying to clarify or make us understand. And so, if the purpose of trying to prove that the Buddha is an infallible being or is someone who you can take refuge in, then if you don't have anything to go on about what they said, how they explained it, what they realized, how they passed that on, and you start talking about someone like Amitabha who's sitting in a pure realm, you have nothing to go on. You have nothing to say, that you have nothing to hold on to or try and use to try and actually prove that this person is someone who I can take refuge in or is someone who can actually be infallible for what I need. And so the minimum requirement to be able to prove that someone is an infallible being is to at least have something they've said and have an explanation for what they've said and have the ability to see whether what they're saying is true or not.
다 상기 여밤에랑 간주 캡수 칸데 두고 열세도 캡수 도단데 여밤에랑 간주 캡수 두고 얼어 상기 임비천 캡수 두고 얼어 도단 칸데 두고 얼세도 상기 샤제 똠바 샤제 투바 생이디 당고 좋아 두니 교바 임바다 상기 임바 차상 룹사비 룸니 데라 위징 예바 상만예 세비젤라 상계 여밤에 코랑기 셰네 아니 상계 가지고 말해서 아니 대화징이 신감세야 ngobar가비 신감세야 대라 상계 미주고생에 딘디 상계지에 요레스 대라 아니 여밤에 생이 상계 딘디지에 요레스 대야 아니 코랑기 코 딘디딘디로 추딘디딘디 송고 요레스 딘디 송바 송나 딘디기 차네 가지고 여밤에 상계 주승근 진시지 겹서줘야 돼 두슬려 버려다.
So those who do take refuge in Buddha, other Buddhas like Amitabha, because they are Buddhas and we do take refuge in them. The reason why we do that is because Shakyamuni came, Shakyamuni explained the path to attain Buddhahood, and we studied the path to liberation. We have understood that the Buddha did certain things which made him a fully realized being or a Buddha. And then when Shakyamuni himself says there are also other realms where there are other Buddhas in places like Sukhavati, where there is Amitabha, and then in this realm there is this Buddha, in that realm there's their Buddha, and they all have their own retinue and they have their own thing going on. Then when Shakyamuni says this, then based on the words of Shakyamuni, who we should have already understood is a protector, is an infallible being, has attained Buddhahood, then when they are saying all of these things, then that's how you kind of develop faith to other Buddhas. But the source is still Shakyamuni.
손자다 상계 요바멜 잡수 줘와롱은 샤제도 상계 뭐 룹차오시 거다.
So if you really want to go for refuge to other Buddhas like Amitabha, you have to have already established that Shakyamuni is a Buddha first. You have to know that.
레디네야 덤바 샤제도 상계 룹쇼세나 나 요바멜 잡수 줘딩이 망고지. 덤바 샤제도 상계 뭐 룹쇼세나 룸마퉁에 리빈 남샤탄데 셰샤바 디 든조 탄다 고마퉁에 이네야 가드요나 요바멜 잡수 줘딩이 타녀 표지시니 다 지시대 제딩이 줄다 망고였다. 낭변나로 망고였다.
Whereas a lot of Buddhists who, I think it's called Pure Land Buddhism, right? Who take refuge or they practice and they recite Amitabha's mantras and they try and attain or reach the pure realm of Amitabha. How many of them, if you ask them to explain why Shakyamuni is a Buddha or why Shakyamuni, do we consider Shakyamuni to be a Buddha, while having firm belief that Amitabha is a Buddha and practicing Amitabha and going for refuge in Amitabha, when you ask them why is Shakyamuni considered a Buddha, if you'll probably notice that a majority of them don't really know why we consider someone to be a Buddha or why we consider them infallible, why we consider them a protector, a teacher and so on.
다이네 이지체디 덤바 샤적투버기 송바 송장 이지신이 두고요래. 이네 덤바 샤적투버 코라 상게임바 이지체데바마도 리비 두고요 말다. 저도도 됐다.
So basically, just to kind of like summarize this, we have faith in Shakyamuni Buddha and what he says, but the faith in Shakyamuni Buddha what he says leads us to have faith in other things, but it's not something that we really have necessarily understood or been able to prove or support with our own understanding.
So that di dodan di nashin chigujison chuju shambalayan chulu shambalayan nangba mai chulu shambalayan tensan koro yiji jangyang cheji dubsholana dubtuya mebajil yiji jangyang chin dodingi mangboyor wa.
And this is not exclusive to Buddhism, even other traditions and other spiritual traditions, they also have the same thing where they have a lot of faith. But then if you ask them why they have faith or to explain why what they believe makes sense, now if they've understood what they believe, then it's the same, it's more or less the same.
So that the Indu Kechambudi Karachagdlana, Kansa Jigi, Maranzugi, Tongshusu Magurbe, Nilu Shambaji Teshi Gabji, Yishe Cheka Drovala, Mela Kansa Tela Yishe Leguaji. Yishe Nishin Yobi, Nishi Chechoyag, Jumzin Shech Gormado, Di Namsha shaking Kansa Della, Dagas Yishizam Mado, Jumzin Changbi Nishike Kan Shemena, and a quick Sungishaba, Namsha Shamba Kandijili Yishaba, this Tangma Rodan Della, Tangazo Yishizam just a ton Rodia, Kansuso Lola, De Gaudo Che, and Nawal Koyundi. Gumze Kariyoda make a jamash, Nawal Koyud, Semnala Jixonaro Shike, and Tagarangi, say Egyptian Robert, that di Dodandi, Digiomar, Namasangi Lula Chaba in the Digiomar, Churumudu Lula Chaba in the Dodandi and Digiomar, one is na Nigal Digiomar.
So before having or like feeling some sort of faith or devotion towards unknown, unseen beings who have never ever come on amongst us, if we have faith and devotion and we rely on them, and the reason why we have faith and devotion is because there is another person who we have faith and devotion towards, and they have spoken of them. But in all of these situations, we ourselves are not sure whether what the person that we rely on or we feel a fondness or devotion towards, if we haven't understood what they're saying and we're not certain about what they're saying, if we haven't got any certainty in their teachings, then I think it's important to know or recognize that the reason why we have devotion is because we like something about them. They've said something, they've done something, some aspect about them is appealing to us. And based on that feeling that we feel, when we associate with them solely based on that feeling, not just based on that feeling, but solely based on that feeling, we have kind of directed our lives, or we have generated faith and devotion in them. But from the Buddhist perspective, this way of cultivating faith and devotion is just faith. There is nothing else other than faith. And according to the Buddhist tradition, this is not the way to generate faith. This is not the way to practice. But it's not just the Buddhist way. Even according to the non-Buddhist traditions, if you really think about it, this is not how you generate faith. This is not how you cultivate devotion in their traditions as well. So, yeah.
Kede nangba chiruba nigagi rodan tagana yina. Yishe nyeshi nyemogo yishe tagana yina. Nangba chiruba shungniga nang tseme shung tengoye yo mare. Susumgi riba tengoye yo mare. Susumgi riba nangbi tumo mayi bike mare. Chiruba susumgi riba susum tsam mayi ba. 다양하게 남샤 시고로 다양하다 다동 낭분님 쯧지 수숨sam기 캬바 두구민도 다동 취시 시고도 nga 시고도 세지 제바체마고 휴시기도 지루베 흉나로라 지루베 따도 띵사고 휴시고 하고 디 가리 디기 가리 쳔토 걸라나 지루베 로단 대가라님 쳔고 왔다 근데 이시신의 조야마 임바 그 딜 줌제징이 로고고 요바 인디 아니 줌제 때는 베지 리보망고 송디기도 지루베 코란소 리보망고 송디기도.
The fact that it is like this it's not very difficult to understand, because if you consider the amount of texts or the amount of teachings that both Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions have on what we translate as epistemology or pramana, you see for yourself that the emphasis that they place on the generating the correct means to realize things, which is essentially what we do in Tariq, where we study the three modes, or we study how you can cultivate inference, is such a central aspect where there is an infinite amount of literature and there are enormous discussions on what makes inference valid or not and what makes a reason valid. And the Buddhists say 3 modes are required. Non-Buddhists have enormous literature that say 3 are not enough. You need 4 modes, you need 5 modes, you need 6 modes. And the fact that there is this dialogue or there is this discussion that has been going on for centuries between Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions it makes it amply evident that both of these traditions, the way that they claim that one has to follow the teachings is by being able to understand and generate an understanding and a comprehension of their own teachings. And to that effect, they are trying to understand and explain the means to acquire knowledge. And the means to acquire knowledge is correct evidence or correct reasons. And the fact that you find so much literature in non-Buddhist traditions and Buddhist traditions, and the dialogue between the two of them makes it immediately clear that their emphasis is not just relying on the person through faith and not doing anything else to devote your life or follow them.
Dire. Ta kede त्यंबजी shungi nalola namsha gyumzen khayen theme deba. Chik yore, ni yore, dus yore se deshe chikbu mato, deshe keme kasa ta kanda o shing dende tarbasana shingam dende ji yore, chik dende ji yore, ni dende ji yore, ndi keranzu yiji chegores, seje, ndi ishi chegores, kajilana di nge songyores, di wala ani gyumzen khayan keje she me deba, dende ji chik chungba yina, ta kore tradition kore tharane, ta yiji shin doere mato, ko gyumzen kono dogugu meba indi ko gyumzen thonde dogugu meba sonza yijishin doedre ani gyumzen namshe koranzu shungi nala tyungi yo mare sungi yo mare tharita ta kangsumba di ani zoe chidar kachaba law nashin ta zoe songbare nga takana kelen ro yure se keje digana le ruwa ta nangba dota di timarita.
If the founder of a certain tradition, they themselves never explained what they were saying, and they just said, it is like this, it is like this, there is this, there is this, there is this, and they left it at that. Then as a follower of that tradition, you don't have much of a choice other than saying what you're saying is like that because you have said it, and then you follow it as they have said it. And if that is the kind of tradition that has been laid out, then the only way to follow something like that is to just believe in what they've said and go with it. But that's not how the Buddha has laid it out. That's not how the Buddha has explained it. And instead of just leaving it at this is how it is, this is how it is, there was a lot of explanations behind that. And so the way to follow the teachings of the Buddha is not just have faith in them because the Buddha came around and said that.
So that ngazo to sheche thangbo lamla shu cholam la shu tine cholam ni jorlam ni tholam gomlam skeje do she yundi ti lam gomya changma di gomja gi tyen khare yi baina den tela thangbo chime nyeba ne dinde nyeba nye shebi tyen tela ani gyabdin sonam gi choda nyamdu daje ani gom yungdu cholam tini digi tokbada masona garo ya togu cha yundu ani jorlam dindigi tokbadi toru do yundu ani gomja tyen ngusum tong yundu tonglam ani ngusum도 통네 미든쇼 세게 쳐도 콤바테 윤데 곰람 아니 도시자 아니 밀로블람 스케제 셰윤데 곰자게 되는데 세메 녀바녀바시 고고 왔다 녀바녀바시면나 람드베 림베 케제 셰사요 말이 이켜랑 이제 여바선자다 이치디가 아니 다 솔람데레 다 이치디 다동 무튼데 되되나 졸람레버레 아니 통람레버레 곰람 케제요 말이 또네 또비 되는데 아니 ten to shaba di gomje lo de ani kebar do pan doje ani lamgi keje shego di mado chinje la lamlo doksa yomarta sonal mashu gi chabta kanda ngazu mida su churu namda namsha keje she shaba dinzo ri dinzo gari yimba ina kanda seme mado bashini kana yishi 가주먹고 가주니 깨원이 깨와 이시신 되어 봐이나 kanda lamashu le digir mado lam doksa yomarta.
So if you look at the presentation of the Buddhist stages of the path, there's accumulation, preparation, seeing, meditation, and no more learning. Before you can even get into that, you have to know, you have to have realized what you are cultivating. When you have realized what you're cultivating, now realized here means with valid cognition, then when you have the supporting conditions of merit or certain conditions that support that, that's when for the first time you get onto the path of accumulation. Then when that realization of having known its object gets progressively stronger, then you get onto the path of preparation. When then you sustain that and you cultivate that, and that then becomes non-conceptual, then you're on the path of seeing. And then when that direct realization of your object further starts acting as an antidote that removes the obscurations, then you go through the various stages of meditation, the path of meditation. But to even get anywhere close to getting on the path, the basic requirement is to know what you are meditating on. So these 4 truths and their 16 aspects, you have to know them. Valid cognition needs to know them. Having faith that it's like that, you can have faith that it's like that, but if you have faith that it's like that and you wonder whether this faith, when you try and make it stronger or strengthen it, until it turns into a valid cognition, not direct, until you realize what you're talking about, there is no access to the path, there is no discussion of the path, it's not even in your realm of existence. So your faith can sustain you as much as it can, but even if you do it for eons and eons and eons, and you never actually understand or realize what you have faith towards, there is no discussion of path. You will never have access to it. You will always be outside the paths that have been taught by the Buddha that lead to liberation. There's no doubt about this. That's just how it is.
Soza ta dinde yindu kanla, soza ta kyoba sodan di dinde ji yimba yindu ta domba kangi sungshebi sungtela. Ani ta demba du mindu seyagi ta seju chegudu ta seju cheyagi tablong seju cheyagi tablong karisena seriba ina kari seju cheyagi koranzo 식 tablong captures mishinjik duwa mishinjik yoroda karina di karisha chek cheyagi tina shin ta nganzo la demba digi dinde sungsha ta kangla kang demba mare skeje shega roba ina demba imegi yewa chesagi nganzo la mishinjik goroda tablong ji goroda 디 가rel라나 딘시 양다 수숨들이다 따양다 소자 따 따양다로 마데나 따양다로 마덴바이나 디뎀바 임바다 디뎀바 마임바 카얀 때는 파두고 말다 소자 수숨기지 뭐 코나를 땡시 안 텔러지 빈네바두 텔러지 빈네바 수구두 텔러지 빈네바 미두스 도스 로고바 인데 소자 리글럼 장야디 신도니 계중 못다
kind of how if you are following the physical sciences, your validation of a certain theory or not requires instruments that will allow you to test the validity of your theory. And so, as someone involved in the physical sciences, your means to gain knowledge are heavily reliant on the kind of instruments that you can develop that then give you insight into whatever you're trying to realize. Similarly, over here, if you have access to the teachings of the Buddha and access to teachings of other traditions that are saying things that are distinct or different from one another, the means we need, the same way that someone who is a scientist involved in the physical sciences reads some instrument or needs a tool to be able to test the validity of various scientific theories, we need a tool to be able to test the validity of what is being said. And that tool is nothing other than reasons or signs. What makes a sign correct, what makes a sign incorrect. Without having understood what a correct sign is, or what an incorrect sign is, it's impossible to see that that explanation is accurate, this one is inaccurate, or this explanation is correct and that explanation has faults and contradictions within it. And so the purpose of learning how to reason and this way of thinking that you have all learned, it's indispensable, because without it you are not equipped at all in any way whatsoever to test whether this is accurate or not, or whether that is accurate. And so you're left without any means or any tools to see whose teaching is accurate, whose teaching is not accurate, and then how do you ever go about trying to say, this is someone who I have faith in, I rely on, and this person can actually protect me. You're ill-equipped, you don't have that means. So the only means to gauge for us is the reasoning. That's why we consider it so important, if not indispensable.
Manzo di ijishin roshan digorta yangi digon ngazo tsiriba nashi kogi labdu de yanga goni yangi takje shigin yes ro kana tsiriba ge nima sharche we zambuding le le kacha digas korgi dos labsha de tadi de tsiriba lar de nga iji chigme marang takje shiga dugis labina kale khadu soro jero da tsiriba labsha ba di ngazo takje che chigo marwa tsiriba proof de chebit neshana ngazo tagaran kilen rosha warwa di digorta.
For instance, if scientists say things, our general attitude even with them is the same, right? Like they've said it works, science says it's right. For instance, the light takes so long to come from the sun to the earth, you'll find rarely people say, no, I don't trust this, I want to go and measure the time that's required for this to happen. But that's okay. If the scientific community says something, it's okay to trust that they go. You don't need to sit there and try and figure out for yourself each individual fact that has been said. You can trust it, it's fine.
Taina ganzo dela sangi ki chik sung saba yindi toma shaja do chik sung saba yindi ta toma shaja do ki chik sung sa sha gombo lu gi tharan de shi gyap sa sha ta khonjo tak je che sare ta nga tak je che go ke yo mar nga yishin duila na digi yo mar dila digi yo ta.
Whereas if you're following the Buddha and you use the same reasoning and you say, oh well, the Buddha checked for himself, he figured it out. Not only did he do all the reasoning, after that, even someone like Arya Nagarjuna, he said the same thing. They figured it out. I can trust and go forward. It doesn't work. It's not the same. It doesn't work. When you're talking about practicing the Dharma, it doesn't work like that.
Ma leva yine kiranse ta ngal labse ta koran ta jishin labgi yosare ta ngadu che goya ma koran khari labsha ba ta jishin doshegila digo ma.
For instance, you might also say, if you take it down all the way down and you say, well, I have. Like you might say, oh well, Gen has done this reasoning, he's figured it out, he's thought about it, he's reasoned it out and made perfect sense of it. We don't need to do that, we'll just trust what he says and go with it. Doesn't work.
So the digyo marta sangye bi chögi nyamlengal geje she yundi lamo komo koran so yi khari takje shini she shab di ngazola takje she lelar dor ma do takje process tagarang suso rang dogorta.
Because what you're doing over here is you're talking about cultivating a practice. You're talking about practicing it. It's different. And so when you're talking about practicing it, the advantage of having someone who has done it is that they're making that process easier for us. But the same reasoning and the same analysis and the same investigation and the same process that they've gone through, each one who follows them has to go through the exact same process and go through all those steps.
가르치니 로고래라나 소소 랑기 가르친 디 따지 제국을라나 수수 gyula digi midun chol zimbi chinchu lo susu gyula yor. Mi shamba gyula yor mari.
And the reason why you have to do this individually is because the belief of the direct opposite of what they are telling us is an innate belief that we have inside us. We have those innate opposing views. Because we are within ourselves have innate opposing views, we ourselves have to figure out whether our way of thinking is right or not. So we have to go through that same reasoning ourselves.
So gumbulurugi taji she tenla pa korang gomsha ju digi ni gyula yodu bi chinchu lo del kain nyung mari.
So Arya Nagarjuna, having gone through all of his efforts and reasons and thinking and reflections, has no impact, zero impact on my misconceptions.
So ni gyula dungel devar zimbi pungbola dungel demba thongi yo mari pungbola dungi yo mazimba chechi de digore dungel laba ina 소롱 문주 등에지고 디레질 마도 삼로 코르게 요마 디레신 ngazo chinjulo 다가랑 깬 데데도.
For instance, irrespective of how much Arya Nagarjuna might have done whatever he did, I still feel that my aggregates are not suffering. My understanding of suffering is largely limited to manifest feelings or sensations of pain. And the rest of the time, I'm pretty comfortable with the fact that my body and my mind are not the nature of suffering. So irrespective of what he might have done, I'm sitting happily, complacent with my understanding of suffering, being limited to just feelings of pain, while the rest of it, I still believe naturally that this is all okay, this is not suffering.
Right? So the day into that, Dunga said, so Munju with the Richmond Salomakona, Deva said, Tiki Doksho Tata, get so Munju, Madjil, some Kong Marwa.
If suffering then is identified by sensations of pain, then happiness by default is going to be identified by sensations of happiness. That's natural.
And
because then that becomes our narrative or version of happiness, then because those little moments of joy, they are easily derivable from external sources, it's natural, or it's kind of granted that you will try and find sources of little hits of joy from external things. It's natural, that's how you'll act.
So that the end tangi geje shed kazangazu geje shediage demba shilami bi chinjilu lodi tak koranganazu gulu yederta ngazu tanda ngunji matu soso tona madel hadera madu mundu gyurtiki yorda.
That's why all of these 16 misconceptions of the 16 aspects of the Four Truths, we have all of them. We have all of them, we've always had them. We might not be aware that we've had them. We might have a hard time recognizing that they're there. But not only are they there, they're manifest and they taint everything that we do.
The India that Chinjulogodi, never so good, Chinjulogodi, never so good, Kalanga the Shumitamanashi, Chinjulogodi, never so gonna. Teda Zindangi will look a gugre, Teda Zindangi will look digi, Shin the Mindu Seji, Shin Sunchung Gugre, Sakazanga Josua, Dima to Talan Shemba Yomare, Sakazan Kejisheswa, Digi Kareta Dingore, Yishi Sheba digi Shin Sunchung Yomare, Yishi Sheba digi Shin Sunchung Omare, Simetang Nishi digi Shin Sunchung, Odirta.
So if you remember, we went through of the various antidotes. The only one that can act as an antidote to these misconceptions is the one whose mode of apprehension is contradictory. And if you remember, the mind whose mode of apprehension is contradictory is the one that removes or refutes its object of engagement. So the only way that you can counter the misconceptions is by realizing that their objects of engagement don't exist, by refuting them. Again, what this is showing is refuting the objects of engagement doesn't happen because you have faith that it's not like that, or you believe it's not like that. You have to refute it through valid cognition. You have to cultivate a valid realization of its object not existing. Just having faith that it's not like that isn't going to cut it. That was also clearly said before.
So that Shin Sunchungo Yindu, any Shin Tardo, you the Truba Yina, until a rigby dinner say that, till a dig nurse say again, the Ribokuech Kotwa.
So if you're going to say the way that our misconceptions believe things to exist is wrong, you have to say it is wrong because were it to be correct, it would have to be like this, but this is not possible. This is contradictory. And so unless you can give a reason to support why the objects that our misconceptions believe to be real are not real, if you can't support that, or you haven't understood that by seeing how it's contradictory with how it could possibly be, then you can't do anything about that. And the way to see that there is something that contradicts it is by finding a reason to demonstrate or make one understand why the way we believe things to be can't be accurate. Without a reason to make us generate that understanding or realization, how does one even proceed? What do you do?
다 상계 비추어 그런 게 도당 거는 다가나 임베인데 다 수숨기 리고 되면 로사 거면 도와 디인데다 디인데 나조다 단단 가지고 비준낭데 디 파중사기다 충고도 마선에 야 똑사디 나렌데 인데 아니 나렌데 추주낭로라 도당 디스다 디인데 아니 체머리 비기 남샤 셰데야디 수숨기 리고기 남샤 셰데 디 설등이 코란 슝 Koran so robata sung tangbu shung tinge deshi gyamye ma kor dodan kor de garan yim ngobi nizu dodan de deston rogu yo sonsa ani riglom dinzo malabya dan dinzo gozu barwa phagin gozu ra ngajo phebe sabdo sheju ke marwa.
So if this is how this is how the Buddha's teachings are, right? Now you're seeing it. This is how the Buddha's teachings are made. That's how they are taught. And so this thing of learning, reasoning and learning how to reason is not something that we Tibetans invented. When we consider the tradition that came into Tibet, the source of the Buddhist tradition that came to Tibet was Nalanda in India. And because this was how the teachings of the Buddha were taught, in Nalanda itself they developed texts on pramana. And so the text that you are seeing now is from India, that was developed in India. And the way that the teachings of the Buddha are taught, or they were taught in India, was supported through reasoning. Because that's an indispensable tool to be able to understand the teachings of the Buddha, and then after having been clarified and explained and taught, it was passed down to Tibetans. So this tool of using reasoning and debate to understand the text is not something that's uniquely Tibetan. It's just carrying on something that came in India, that was developed in India, because that's how the teachings of the Buddha were understood.
Tire di indu da sangye bi shung pena duwa pha pebe shamba shungjin sangma ta kanda rigbe gan ten la pha be kyangya re.
That's why amongst all the teachings of the Buddha, apart from Vinaya or the monastic rules, everything else has to be established through reasoning.
Tire ta duwa jigudi nedang khagare duwa le ribu tayen ke yomare sangye khorangi cheba zeje tim sueje ani diche chog mare seji ta gyablu nenga yumje she yo shogure dine kanda susu gi shu ribu di keje sheza yomata.
So with Vinaya, for instance, why the Buddha said certain things for the monastic community, there's not much reasoning or much analysis that's required over there, because the Buddha himself, having seen certain situations that were favorable for a certain kind of behavior or other situations where it was inappropriate to behave in a certain way, he said, or he made a certain rule that then we follow as someone who then decides to belong to that monastic community. So even though there may be situational, societal, cultural reasons for why the Buddha said something at that given time, once you follow that tradition, there's not much reasoning to say, I will choose to do this because it contradicts or not. You just follow that because that's how that tradition came about. Everything else that is not the rules of the monastic community has the same exact process that has to be reasoned out to be understood.